Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Policy Forum, How to Fix the Budget, Getting Specific. This is hosted by the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget. That committee is a nonpartisan, nonprofit, oxymoronically named organization committed to educating the public on fiscal issues and promoting fiscal responsibility. I'm Bill Frenzel, co-chairman. I speak for my fellow chairs Tim Penny and Charlie Stenholm, for President Maya McGinnis, and for the board of the organization. As part of our ongoing program, the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget has called for credible plans to close the fiscal gap. Pretty hard to have a credible plan to close the gap without having policymakers provide specific proposals. To help set up an environment conducive to offering and debating these specific solutions, the committee is convening this forum as a beginning act in spotlighting thoughtful ideas and those who have had the courage and the capability to present them. We are also launching a series of Let's Get Specific papers. You'll find two of them in your booklets, one on Social Security and one on health care. You will also find some papers at the check-in table from other groups who we've invited to bring materials in. We will shortly produce two more, one on defense spending and one on tax expenditures, and more will follow after that. We are, this series of papers, we hope, will continue the debate in some kind of specific terms. Now, these are not the unvarnished and last word. They are examples of what has to be done to close that fiscal gap. There are plenty of other ideas around, and we are encouraging people to put them forth. Ours may not be the best, and they are certainly not the only ones. We hope they elicit many more such proposals. Ultimately, after the election, there will be two important commissions reporting. One, the Domenici-Rivlin Commission, which will have the particular stature behind it of acknowledged budget experts. And then we will have the report of the President's Commission, a group of 18 people selected by the President and the Congress who are working hard, and we hope we'll be able to come to some kind of specific recommendation. We have, of course, no guarantee that they will be able to achieve it. For purposes of debate, we believe there shouldn't be any third rails. Our leaders have to put forth their best ideas and be willing to discuss them. We hope that today's event and the papers that will follow will ignite this essential dialogue and lead us eventually to closing that fiscal gap. Our first two speakers today were scheduled to sing a duet. Senator Gregg, however, apparently has developed laryngitis. He's unable to perform this morning, and so Senator Ron Wyden is going to give us a solo. It will be a remarkable feat if he can present himself and Senator Gregg in one fell swoop. Ron Wyden served 7 terms in the House, part of which I witnessed, and they were good terms. Before going to the Senate, he serves on the Budget and Finance Committee. He and Senator Gregg have jointly produced a bill which is exactly the kind of thing that our committee wants to see more of. I'm very privileged to present to you Senator Wyden of Oregon.
Thank you very much, Bill, and a unquestionably inflationary introduction. Two of the orchestrators of this whole effort are part of what I call the good folks caucus, people who really believe ideas matter. Bill Frenzel, I will tell you, I also chair the Senate Finance Subcommittee on International Trade. We have talked often about trade matters, and if you are looking for good counsel in this city, somebody who looks at expansionist trade policies, you almost always want to talk to Bill Frenzel in a hurry. So, Bill, thank you very much. Good to be with you. And also, the bionic woman of sensible budgeting and tax policy, our own Maya McGinnis. How about a big round of applause for Maya? Good work, and thank you for this invitation. Someday the Supreme Court is going to declare it to be cruel and unusual punishment to let Senate types start waxing on and on a Friday morning. And with Maya's consent, what I thought I'd do is take just a few minutes and give you my sense of where we are on taxes, and then let's just kind of throw it open to questions and almost do this almost a little bit more informally than most of what happens in the city. First, you should know that this really is a partnership with Senator Greg. Jim Carter is here, and he's been doing yeoman work with John O'Neill and our staff. We work every week for literally 2 years to put together what now is the first bipartisan tax reform bill in a quarter century. And it picks up on some of the principles that Ronald Reagan and Bill Bradley led the fight for 25 years ago. I am another tall Democrat on the Senate Finance Committee who got a basketball scholarship. My jump shot is obviously not quite Senator Bradley's, but I also understand the value of teamwork. And I could not have had a better Republican partner than Senator Gregg in this effort, and he really is not able to speak today, and that is why I sort of held the torch of trying to lay out both of our positions. And I want to start simply by saying that I am very much aware that all of the prognosticators, all of the people who run around and write op-ed pieces and the like, are predicting gridlock for as far as the eye can see. They're saying on these major issues, on energy policy, and you take one issue after another, they're saying it's going to be gridlock. We're not going to be able to see anything get done. Well, accuse Senator Gregg and I of being happy warriors, or however you want to describe us. We believe that major tax reform is the issue that can break that gridlock and, in effect, bring Democrats and Republicans together and say, for a period of time here, we're not going to spend our time fighting each other. We're going to take on these special interest groups that have done so much to lobby into our tax law thousands and thousands of provisions that give them very narrow benefits, but collectively cost us a tremendous amount of money and drain our ability to lower rates for most businesses, most individuals, keep progressivity, and grow the economy. And in fact, I'd go so far as to say that the debate that's being held right now between whether you ought to re-up for the George W. Bush tax policy or sign up for the Obama proposal is the wrong debate to be having right now. Either of those two approaches on offer now, the George W. Bush proposal or the Obama proposal, mean that you will ratify into stone a broken, discredited tax system. A broken, discredited tax system where Americans devote 7.6 billion hours a year to trying to comply with 10,000 sections. All right? You sign up for George W. Bush's re-upping that plan or the Obama plan, you're saying we're still going to spend billions of hours and comply with 10,000 sections and spend $200 billion, 15% of the tax revenue the IRS spends simply trying to comply with all this. That's what you sign up for. We don't think that's the right debate to have. And I will tell you, personally, the more relevant comparison is what the country got in the 80s when Democrats and Republicans got together and pushed for a more pro-growth, fairer, and simpler tax system, as opposed to what happened between 2001 and 2008. And here are the numbers. They're really quite staggering. When President Reagan and Democrats worked together, 16 million new jobs were created, and there was a 17.6% expansion in payroll. That's what happened when there was bipartisanship on a pro-tax, pro-growth tax policy. When you had Democrats and Republicans working together, you really saw a pro-growth engine for job creation. By comparison, from 2001 to 2008, when the tax debate was pretty much all partisan, all the time, 3 million jobs were created. That was a 2.3% expansion in payroll. So what you had was anemic job growth when you had a tax policy dominated by partisanship, and very robust job growth during the 80s when Democrats and Republicans got together. So our view, Senator Gregg and I, that by cleaning out the clutter in the tax code, broadening the base, lowering the rates, Americans get a more pro-growth, simpler, and fairer system. Now, the principal argument of 1986 is just as valid in 2010. And that is, and Bill remembers all these discussions from the Ways and Means Committee, is that marginal rates, that rate that you pay on the last dollar of income, is still enormously important. Preferences are not. Preferences don't get you the same kind of value that you will get from broadening the base, lowering rates, keeping progressivity, and the kinds of principles that we believe fuel those numbers that I just gave you from 1986. Now also, Senator Gregg and I spent a lot of time, and Jim and John remember this, going through the issues relating to global competitiveness. And here you bump up against the following. If you go to a coffee shop anywhere in America, people say, why are we given all these tax breaks for shipping jobs overseas? People just don't understand that. I mean, it just kind of gets in their craw, and everybody in politics talks about how they don't want to ship jobs overseas. Then you go to the companies, and the companies say, well, the reason we got to do business overseas is because the United States has the second highest corporate rate in the world, and we can't be competitive, and because we have operations in the United States, we have operations overseas, they complement each other, we can't be competitive in these tough global markets without these various breaks overseas, deferral, and the like. And so the debate just goes forward again with that kind of paralysis. What Senator Gregg and I did, not unlike what Ronald Reagan, Bill Bradley, Dan Rostikowski, Bob Packwood, all of those who were involved in this, did 25 years ago, is Senator Gregg and I went to American businesses and said, how low would the American corporate rate have to go in order for you to give up these kinds of tax breaks for doing business overseas that are so offensive to the American people. And what we got was 24% on the corporate, side. So we go for C Corps from 35 to 24, and for all businesses we give them immediate, write-offs and substantial benefits in terms of the cost of equipment. That American business says we can have a conversation over. That's something we can work with. So that's the kind of trade-off you make if you're trying to write pro-growth tax policy that is bipartisan. So where our bill is, 15, 25, and 35 are the rates on the individual side. We get rid of the alternative minimum tax. We triple the standard deduction for individuals. We lower the corporate rate. S-corps and partnerships and sole proprietors benefit from the fact that the top rate has not moved, and the expensing credits and the like. We think we now have a tax policy that is based on a fundamental American proposition, and that is everybody has a chance to get ahead. Everybody has a chance to be successful with the kind of tax outline that Senator Gregg and I have offered. If you don't have much, this bill creates opportunities for you to get ahead. If you're successful, we're not saying we're going to push you to the sidelines and take away your incentives to be successful as well. And in the process, I think we solve a number of related problems. As you know, there's a big fight about carried interest as it relates to Wall Street and the question of traders for whom that's very important. Senator Gregg and I say that we'll give everybody a capital gains exclusion of 35%, and then on top of it, we'll have a progressive approach with respect to capital gains taxation. This, too, has brought us considerable support with the sense that, yes, rates will be a bit higher, but investors will have substantial, incentives. They will have substantial incentives, and most of the calculations, Jim and John, correct me, come in with our approach on capital gains that most folks would probably pay in the vicinity of about 20, 21%, slightly higher, but again, with the top rate staying where it is, substantial incentives to get ahead. So let me close with this. We have 3 separate reports now that have been very favorable to this. The Heritage Organization, which I will admit I do not quote every single day in behalf of my initiative, said that our legislation would create 2.3 million jobs per year. 2.3 million additional jobs per year. The Manufacturers Alliance said it would create 2 million jobs, hundreds of billions of dollars in extra disposable income. And we also got a very favorable review from Brookings. So left, right, and center has been favorable on this. President George W. Bush had a commission with a number of similar ideas, particularly on simplification. Paul Volcker issued a report just very recently where if you go down it, they literally, item by item by item, track with a bipartisan bill that Senator Gregg and I have written. And so the question now is, are we going to be able to summon up the political will? And will people like yourselves say, this is something that can bring the country together. This is a way to create jobs without adding to the federal deficit. Our score is neutral in terms of static scoring, in addition to creating the new jobs. You can't turn around the deficit, which is what Maya appropriately put this group together around, with a weak economy, folks. You need a pro-growth economy. I think we offer those kinds of principles, and I will tell you that I think the choice today, at a time when so many are predicting, gridlock and clenching their teeth and saying, when we need some cooperation, we're not going to get it. This is a chance to break out of that kind of paralysis. So I very much appreciate the chance to come. Softball questions are especially welcome. And let's just throw it open for a few minutes. Maya said we had a half hour or whatever we have left, and let's just throw it open. Yes?
Senator, you speak of the broad bipartisan support that is already developed. You speak of the broad bipartisan support that is already developed. Tell us about the resistance that you anticipate. It might be a polite way of saying whose ox is getting gored, and therefore who's going to mount an effort to try to block this.
Question was who blocks it? The opponents are essentially the same opponents that you saw before. Anybody who has been incredibly good at lobbying a really narrow tax break into the tax law, has gone to the Ways and Means Committee, gone to the Finance Committee, and been incredibly successful at getting Congressperson X to get them that little, goodie. Those are the potential block of opponents. They were, before, and they will say, those folks on the Finance Committee and Ways and Means Committee, that's a bunch of hooey. They're never going to lower your taxes. They're just going to take away that break that's so important to you. And Western civilization is going to end if we take away that little break that we work for. Remember all those years that we lobbied and we pushed for that little break? God, they'll never lower your rates. That's all a bunch of nonsense. They're going to lower your rates. They're just going to take it to use it for some other foolish spending program. And today, with the capacity to frighten people, and look, I'm very much aware that much of the country thinks the federal government can't run a two-car parade, let alone do major tax reform. I'm very much aware of that. What Senator Gregg and I are saying is that if Democrats and Republicans come together around broadening the base, simplifying the code, making it fairer, making it pro-growth, and we join hands, then you don't have Democrats and Republicans going after each other, but instead they're taking on those interest groups that are so serious a force in terms of fighting. So it's a very different kind of economic challenge. And by the way, I will tell you that if healthcare had been a bipartisan approach, and I and a big group of people, or 15 of us, had come together, now, when there is so much back and forth in the country, had you had a bipartisan approach, people would be working together to make the refinements rather than having to fight about whether you ought to have the bill at all and having so many people repeal it. On these big issues, big, important transformational questions like taxes and health, the value of having something that is bipartisan so that you can go after these opponents together rather than having this constant scrum between Democrats and Republicans, I think is an enormous value. There's the bipartisan caucus right over there. They're the happy warrior caucus.
Senator Wyden, since Senator Gregg is retiring, who's your natural partner outside of yourself?
There's a special kind of Senate rule that you don't give out the names of people before they've given their names out. But we have talked to several senior Republicans. I'm very confident we'll have another very capable, person. And as far as I'm concerned, wherever they land, Senator Gregg and Jim Carter, they're in this for the duration, and they both said that. I mean, this is something we're committed to staying at. I think we'll have an influential senior Republican, recognizing, of course, that Senator Gregg's shoes are very hard to fill. Will step up, and I think that particularly right now, when we look at what's being considered in the deficit commission and the challenge of getting votes, this is seen as a bridge to a very different, Congress. I mean, this Congress is ending up now on a pretty, sour note. I mean, normally you have to get 60 votes in a Congress. What we're seeing based on the last few weeks is 60 is enough. You need 100 votes in a Congress in order to move forward in the United States Senate. This could be an issue that could break through. So I'm confident we'll have some senior Republicans.
Senator, this is a real softball question. Did you consider doing anything about some of the big personal exclusions, and pick a few two non-controversial? One would be the home mortgage deduction and the exclusion of employer-provided health insurance?
With respect to employer-provided health coverage, as we know, there are changes already coming as part of the health reform, and they were in my legislation, and I continue to believe that there is a way to ensure that the vast, overwhelming majority of Americans don't get taxed on their health care, but those who are getting $40,000 or $50,000 worth of what is essentially compensation, and they can describe it as health care, ought to have to pay something. So that is already kind of baked into health reform. On the home mortgage issue, Senator Gregg puts it very well when he's been asked about that. He said, we didn't want to kill it on day one. I will tell you, and Bill says this, Maya says this, that once you get some consensus that an issue needs to be tackled in a bipartisan way, I think the history is then you get Democrats and Republicans willing to look at a whole host of areas that have been sacrosanct in the past. The problem is you never get to that point, so somebody then is forced to stick their neck out and faces great, political, postulates. So once you get to that point, and you saw it with the conversations, as you know, because you were there during that period, and when Ronald Reagan, Bill Bradley, Ross Minkowski, Gebhard Packwood got together, people were putting on the table a whole lot of things that nobody would have possibly, thought of. But it's a question of your seatmate asking earlier, are people willing to step up and say, we have allowed the tax code over the years to just become this hydra-headed creature of deductions and credits and complexity. We're at the point, folks, and I want to be very explicit about this, I'm convinced that even when middle-class people get a tax break in America, a lot of them can't use it and can't figure it out. You know how we know that? From the stimulus. The stimulus had $300 billion worth of tax breaks in it. If you walk down the streets of any community in the United States, people would say, there was no net tax relief in the stimulus. What are you talking about? The stimulus bill, that was that big old spending thing with all the pork, and they were studying some goofy thing or something like that. That wasn't a tax relief bill. There were $300 billion worth of tax breaks in the stimulus bill. And virtually nobody in America knows it. And when you talk to Nina Olson and people at the IRS, the taxpayer advocate, they point out that scores never even signed up for things like the credit, the work credit, because they couldn't figure out how to do it and couldn't figure out how it would work. Not exactly an easy form there. So I think that alone provides a kind of indictment of the current system. And why people say, well, let's just do some more tinkering with a completely flawed, discredited, system, I think is a real emperor has no clothes. It's a real emperor has no clothes story. At some point, when you're talking about the tax code, when the emperor walks by without any clothes, you can't say, nice suit, emperor. This is a broken tax system. Yes. I think we get you.
Senator,
This will be the last question.
Great.
we'll all agree that pro-growth and policy and simplification of the tax code is important. Back in the late 70s and early 80s,
Frenzel was the sponsor of something called the Accelerated Capital Formation Act. Ronald Reagan was in support of something he called the Industrial Homestead Act, which was something that is not yet recognized in the tax code except for workers in the private sector, which is a good thing, the ESOPs. Russell Long was in favor of it, so was Hubert Humphrey. So there was very broad bipartisan support for the concept of ownership as something that would embrace what the founders said, what Lincoln did with the Homestead Act, with the land frontier, looking at how do we finance the future of the industrial and technological frontier so that every citizen would be able to become an owner. I think we need an even more radical simplification than you described, and that is one that anyone here can Google capital homesteading, and you'll see that there are books on it, and I believe that this is what's missing in both parties, that these are provisions that make the top 1% richer and the bottom 95% without being able to get a piece of the action. I think this is what's missing in the bipartisan trust.
Mark, can you get a question out of that?
Well, I'm asking, yes, the question is, why shouldn't the task force and the bipartisan people that you have pulled together begin to study and see what is the Capital Homestead Act, because it goes into not only tax policy, but also Federal Reserve policy.
You've said Bill Frenzel is a supporter, so that alone makes me want to take a look at it. So I've not heard of that, and ideas for further simplification, put us down, and we'll have Jim Carter and John O'Neill, look at it. The value here is that we've done this. We've done it, A, and it worked, B, and frankly, I think we even know part of what we ought to do in the future. And this is really loaded kind of stuff. If you think through what happened in '86, probably the biggest single concern you ought to have is that when you bring Democrats and Republicans together, simpler and more pro-growth, fairer, no current Congress can ever bind a future Congress. So what happened was, after 1986, as soon as the ink was dry, everybody went back to kind of business as usual and showing up outside the Senate Finance Committee, on which I served, to start trying to lobby, things, in there. Now, I don't have a proposal for this. I don't want to suggest I do, but reformers this time ought to be thinking about how, as part of reform, once you get it, you at least make it tougher in some way to unravel it, to basically unpack it and undo it and just go back to business as usual. But I just close, Bill's on his feet and I'm going to be off mine, simply by saying, in the 80s, you saw Ronald Reagan, Bill Bradley, and a group of others get beyond the kind of pettiness and smallness and ideology-driven kind of politics, and tangible benefits came to our country with exactly the growth in jobs and payrolls that I've outlined. I think we can do it again. I think the principles that was built around are as valid today as they were then. Call Jim and John weekends and take all their free time, giving us your good ideas, because we would like fundamental tax reform to be the issue that ends the gridlock that is now as far as the eye can see. Thanks for having me.
Thank you very much, Senator Ron Wyden, for showing us how you can be specific and bipartisan. We wish you a lot of luck. It's now my pleasure to introduce Paul Ryan. all of my introductions are brief because these people are all luminaries and their bios are in your packet, so you will know all about them. Paul Ryan has represented for 6 terms the 1st District of Wisconsin, and with distinction, he is the ranking Republican on the Budget Committee, an important figure on the Ways and Means Committee, but he is perhaps best known as Congress's official cartographer, having designed his roadmap. And we are particularly pleased to have with us one of the really bright young members of Congress, Paul Ryan of Wisconsin.
Bill's from Minnesota, I'm from Wisconsin. We refer to ourselves as Catholic deer hunters, they're Lutheran deer hunters. You know, we're kind of kissing cousins. I apologize, but I got to leave in 6 minutes to catch a flight. So do you want a 6-minute speech, or do you want a 2-minute speech and Q&A for 4? So, take the 6. Okay. Well, okay. A couple of things I would just simply say. It's important that we get out there with specifics, with plans and with ideas on how to fix this fiscal problem. That's what I was trying to do when I put the roadmap out there in 2008 during the Bush administration. That's what I was doing when I reran the numbers with CBO, put out version 2.0 in January of 2010. I won't go through all of the details of this plan because 6 minutes is too short, but you can go to AmericanRoadmap.org if you want to look at all of the details. The point I'm trying to make with this very comprehensive entitlement and tax reform plan and budget process reform plan was not to suggest that, you know, this guy had all the answers to fix this problem. What I was trying to do, and what I'm still trying to do, is get this conversation moving to an adult level. Put a substantive plan out there, which is how I would propose to fix this fiscal problem we have, so that other people would put their plans on the table. So we could get on to the business of debating the merits of various proposals, so we can get on to the business of actually fixing this problem. And what I would just simply say is, with the oncoming entitlement tsunami, with the debt crisis that's coming in this country, which the CBO basically confirmed in July, not a question of if, but of when, we've got to get ahead of this thing. And what I would argue is the sooner we tackle our budget and entitlement problems, the better off everybody's going to be. It is not a question of, do we do root canal, painful austerity economics right now or later? No, that's not the choice. The choice is, do we get ahead of this entitlement crisis? Do we put the right kinds of reforms in place right now that do it on our terms so that the changes are gradual and phased in and intelligent? For instance, you don't have to change benefits for people who are already on these programs like Medicare and Social Security. You can phase them in. If you've already organized your life around these programs, if you're about to retire and you've already organized your retirement around them, we can gradually phase these necessary reforms in to save these vital safety net programs and prevent them from imploding. We can do that if we act soon. We can also make sure that we can put in place economic policies that get prosperity back in this country, that put America in the position to lead and thrive in globalization, in the 21st century international economy. So you can have good, Ron and Judd have done this great idea of advancing the tax reform debate that's very constructive. What we're trying to do is say, let's have a plan for prosperity. Let's get ahead of this debt crisis. Let's reform these entitlement programs. Let's use our consensus values that we've reached and established over the 20th century in this country, apply those to the problems, and move forward with a plan that gets prosperity, economic competition, and higher living standards going in this country. I would simply argue, and the basic idea behind the roadmap is, let's protect the safety net. Let's have a reliable and sturdy safety net. For instance, I actually bring up the minimum benefit in Social Security and Medicare so that people don't fall through the cracks under the poverty line when they're in retirement. But at the same time, I proposed, various forms of means testing so that people who are more affluent don't get as much of a subsidy in retirement, when they retire. Basically because they can afford to shovel, to carry more of the burden. So what you have to basically do is get ahead of this problem, start with adult conversations in Washington to fix these issues, and have a tax system that is pro-growth, pro-jobs, pro-exports, and pro-prosperity. The CBO is telling us without a doubt that we are consigning our kids and our grandkids to lower living standards. We know that that is coming. And what's amazing about it is Congress and the White House is not really doing anything about it. And what's particularly troubling at this current silly season we are in is the fact that, again, entitlement reform is being made into a political weapon. I'll just read from Time magazine. Mark Heltrin, in a recent column, said, quote, "In a move as predictable as Lucy pulling the football away from Charlie Brown, Democrats are using Social Security scare tactics to gain ground before the November election. President Obama is not only tolerating this classic old politics maneuver by his party, he is leading the charge." In the National Journal Insiders poll, I'm one of the people who sign up, fill out this poll. It's members of Congress filling out this poll anonymously. A Democrat summed up this election year strategy by saying, with respect to Medicare and Social Security, quote, "I wish we had more to run on than these two tired war horses, but they're probably our best themes." Look, both parties do this to each other. I'm not simply saying that we Republicans have these halos over our heads and the other guys don't. We got to get beyond weaponizing these issues for political gain in the short run. If we don't, if we continue to poison the well on entitlement reform, on tax reform, then it will be bitter austerity. If we kick the can down the road more years in the future, it will be Greek-like austerity. Cuts to current pensioners, cuts to people who rely on the safety net. The safety net itself will get shredded, and big tax increases that will slow down the economy and guarantee those inferior, lower living standards. We've got to get through this political moment. The political weaponization of entitlement reform is very unfortunate. It's hurting our chances of actually getting bipartisan agreement in the near future. It's unfortunate, but we've got to get out there. I just want to close by thanking Maya and all that you do here, Bill, because of all the forces that are out there, you're helping bring the left and the right together to try and get to an adult-level conversation about this. You've actually put ideas out there to move this conversation where it needs to be. A few of us are trying to get there. Unfortunately, the politics are going in the other direction these days, and it's not as if political demagoguery can be turned off on a dime and all goes well. That's the unfortunate moment we find ourselves in. And I just want to, I apologize I can't do Q&A because I got to go catch the flight, but hopefully we can fix this problem. I'm actually pretty optimistic about it because in this country, we always end up getting it right, and like Winston Churchill says, the Americans can be counted on to do the right thing when they've exhausted all other options, and we seem to be going down that path. So thank you very much, everybody. Sorry for the brevity, but I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Congressman Paul Ryan.